Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out for our talk with Dr. Nadia Malinovich, who's coming to us from Paris, which we were all going to visit her in Paris. But a few thank yous before we begin. I want to thank the Cultural Center, and especially Carol Mallison and Athleen Collins for helping us organize a talk today. I want to thank Veronica Lippincott, Brenda Elsey, and maybe that's all I want to thank. That may be all I want to thank. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sally Charno, chair of the Department of History and professor of modern European and post-colonial history. And it's really a great pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Nadia Malinovich. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and she's associate professor of English and American Studies at the Université de Picardie-Jules Verne, and also teaches Jewish history at Sciences Po, that's the short for Sciences Politiques, in Paris. She's the author of a book that was incredibly instrumental to me when I was working on my last book, called French and Jewish: Culture and Politics of Identity in Early 20th Century France, came out in 2008, and co-editor of the volume The Jews of Modern France: Images and Identities, that came out in 2016. Her forthcoming book, Crossing Borders, Shifting Identities, Oral Histories of Jewish Migration from the Muslim World to Canada, France, and the United States, which is what she'll be talking about today, is a transnational history of the last generations of students and teachers who attended the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a Jewish French organization that is centered in Paris. And those schools were organized in the Middle East, across the Middle East, and in North Africa. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll have time for a Q&A.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sally, for the invitation. And thanks for everybody for coming. Okay, so I titled the talk "Becoming Sephardic: Migration and Identity Politics in Transnational Perspective." So what I'm going to do is that's kind of a part of this book is considering how this category of Sephardic and how the people that I interviewed relate to that category. But first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my broader project, and then sort of the history of the term Sephardic and some divisions in Jewish history, and also a little bit about oral history, and sort of as a methodology, and to sort of set us up to understand what I'm going to be talking about, these people, how they relate to this concept of Sephardic. So the first thing, the book title. So this book, interviews with 70 people who grew up in Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia, and now make their homes in France, Canada, and the United States. Some of the people migrated elsewhere. Some of them are multiple migrants. So some of the people first migrated to Israel, then they continued on to the United States or Canada. Some people went to the United States, then Canada, then some people went to France. So in some cases, there were multiple migrations, but that's where the people, I interview them in these countries where they are now. So my interest in this topic was that I was just really interested in the last generations of Jews who grew up in the Arab and Muslim world, what their experiences were like there, why they left that part of the world, their migration trajectories. And I decided to focus the study on the former students and teachers of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which, as Professor Charna was saying, was this organization that created schools all around the Mediterranean basin, starting in the mid-19th century, and ended up being a really important vector of change and in the Arab and Muslim world, and it ended up just to be a way to kind of get at that history and have some kind of a coherent theme, because the study doesn't limit itself, as I indicate, to one country. It's not from one country to one country. It's transnational in two senses, that people coming from various countries and then going to various countries. And just to explain a little very briefly about the Alliance Israélite Universelle. So it's an institution that was founded in 1860. It was a French international human rights organization, or French Jewish, we should say, where they wanted to defend. It was French Jews who were they had been recently, sort of integrated into French society. They had received full rights. They would have been, as we say, emancipated, meaning becoming part of the civic society. With full rights as citizens, and they wanted to share that, they wanted to defend the rights of Jews around the world who, as they saw, weren't as fortunate as them, who didn't, hadn't been emancipated, didn't have, political rights. And so they defended the rights. They had various campaigns, like where Jews were oppressed in different countries. There was a issue in Romania of anti-Semitism in Romania. So they did various political campaigns, but very, very quickly, kind of the major focus of the organization turned to creating schools all around the Mediterranean basin for Jewish communities. And the idea was that in order to the best way to promote Jewish human rights was to give Jews access to a modern education, right? Which in their sense was a sort of a French, Western education, and that this would, help them to sort of enter modernity and fully benefit from the bounties of civilization, right? And here, so we see that it was a project that very much coincided with the rise of French colonialism, or sort of French imperialism, and then later, initially France had a lot of kind of soft imperial power in the late 19th century, and that then increasingly translated into direct colonial power with the protectorates for Tunisia in 1881, Morocco in 1912, and then you have the Mandate for Lebanon after World War I. But even earlier, France is exerting a lot of power, economic, political power around that whole part of the world. And within this context, it's quite easy for the Alliance to set up schools. So they set up all these schools. There's 183 schools operating all around the Mediterranean basin by 1914. Basically, the Alliance, its school network, has been a major area of inquiry for historians. We have several books published on the schools of the Alliance, their impact on Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, and how the relationship between the Alliance and colonialism, and just also the whole the relationship between French Jews and Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. But essentially, there's been almost no attention to the Alliance, the school network, after 1945, because just generally the idea was, these were a big, important factor, in Jewish life in that part of the world. And then after the Jews left after, 1940, in the second half of the 20th century, notably after 1948, creation of the State of Israel, you get tensions in the region, Jews leave, it's the end of the Alliance. But as I realized it's not like that happened overnight. Jews left the Middle East and North Africa over several decades. Things were different in different countries. In some countries, there was big exoduses, right in the early 1950s. Other countries, like Lebanon, particularly like Lebanon, Morocco, people left over the course of several decades, and it wasn't, and the Alliance schools continued to operate. So, and in Iran, you don't have a mass Jewish migration until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And the Alliance was very active in Iran as well. So it seemed really interesting to look at, how did Jewish life change in the Middle East and North Africa after 1948, and then why people left, and to look at that critically and not just be like, and then Israel's created, things got really sticky and everybody left. It's like, let's look in more detail at how this worked in different countries, why people left. So, of course, it seemed like a really great opportunity to be able to interview this last generation of people, since they're still, obviously, it would be wonderful to know how the Alliance students felt in the 19th, early 20th century, but those people are no longer with us, whereas the Alliance graduates now are. So, that was sort of the motive of doing an oral history. And I did also look at the Alliance has a wonderful archive in Paris. I looked at the archive as well. And also I looked at the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Association. I looked at some archival sources, but it's really primarily an oral history project. And so the different themes, as I indicate here, the themes of the book. So first, right, their experiences in the Alliance schools. And here the MENA is a term we use now for the Middle East and North Africa. Right, in a changing world, how do they respond? Like all these things are going on, the rise of Zionism, Arab nationalism, sort of the impact of World War II in various ways. And then, of course, the creation of the State of Israel, decolonization. It's such a turbulent time and so much is going on. So kind of interviewing people about that period. What was it like to grow up in the 1950s and 1960s in Lebanon, or sometimes 40s, 50s, 60s, in Lebanon or Morocco or Tunisia or Iran. Then the immigration and emigration trajectory. So looking at, the reasons why people left, and then also why they went where they went. And that's also something the multifocal approach, the idea of looking that people often had sort of some choice in deciding where to emigrate, or just, circumstance took them to one place or the other, to understand that migration, right? To look at why people went different places. And here I should say that a lot of people went to Israel. And some of my people did go to Israel and then they re-emigrated. There's more literature on people who emigrated to Israel than there is on people who went elsewhere. And it seemed like there were, for various reasons, sort of methodological reasons, it seemed sort of like a different problem, a different issue. So I decided to focus it on, France, the United States, and Canada. And then I sort of talk about Israel comparatively through secondary sources, and also a little bit through some of the people who emigrated there initially. But just to sort of explain that. Okay, so the question that I'm going to, so immigration, then pathways of integration and acculturation. So it's like why they left, why they went where they went, and then how they sort of integrated and acculturated into the societies that they emigrated to. And, in terms of from a Jewish, sort of integrating into the larger Jewish community or not, becoming, French, American, Montrealer, how they relate to that. And what we're going to focus on today, the evolution of their identification, categories of belonging. So, how do they think about themselves? What groups do they belong to? How do they think about their identities and belonging kind of across time and place? Okay, so before delving into the specifics of this study, I just thought it's just to open up a little bit and thinking about the whole idea. I mean, we talk about, there's, the question of identity. There's just the idea of groups, like the idea of, we're always kind of looking for umbrella categories in which to categorize people, in which to categorize ourselves, in which to categorize others. And there's an article, Rogers Brubaker, who wrote this article. He talks about this topic, groupism, right? He kind of gives it a name, and it's something I think we often just take for granted, but this idea, the tendency to treat ethnic groups, nations, and races as substantial entities to which interest and agency can be attributed. Just the idea that's like, it's kind of a creation. You belong to this group, right? And how that works, how that changes over time, why people think of themselves as belonging to one group or the other, and then how we name that group. And here, just to give some examples of names, because I'm going to be talking about this idea of Sephardic, just to be thinking in general about the names that others choose for us, or the names that we choose, and how often those have, they can be loaded, sort of they're political, and they're sort of loaded with meaning, and they can change over time. So just some examples from the United States history, right? Terms for, you have like the sort of the polite term for African Americans in the 1950s. 1940s was Negro, right? The United Negro College Fund, right? Then you have in the 1960s, you get the, Black becomes the preferred term. Then we get into in the 80s, Afro-American, African-American comes. And then some people, of course, there's still the use of Black. But the point is those terms, people use them for a reason. In other words, they have sort of political, emotional meaning, and different generations. People use the terms differently over the generations, right, it's not just random terms. It's people sort of situating themselves in a particular way by using terms. Same, right? Hispanic was the term, 80s and 90s. Then we get to Latino. And then, of course, Latino, Latina, now Latinx, right, about gender identity. So you just see that these evolutions. And then Oriental was kind of the term people used to talk about, let's say you had an Oriental restaurant. Back in the day, was a Chinese restaurant. Now we would never say Oriental has a negative connotation. We would say Asian American. We can also think of like Edward Said wrote a book about Orientalism, the idea of kind of talking about people from the East as a sort of a set, fixed category, kind of racist way of thinking about that group. It's like Oriental is a created group. And then, so looking at Indian, Native American, Indigenous, another example of a group. And I would say also in terms of Indian, Native American, Indigenous, another thing is some people now would say like, well, it doesn't really, those terms aren't that important. Like there's that's actually it's a writer called David Troyer, who's half Ojibwe, Native American, and actually half Austrian Jewish. And I heard him interviewed, and he said he actually, in his writing, prefers the term Indian because it's quicker and it's just less voluminous to say. And he said, in any case, what's important to me is I'm Ojibwe. It's not all these other terms it doesn't really mean that much. So in other words, this choice of words are important. And then just taking an example from French Jewish history, and we can see how these terms, sometimes there's toggling back and forth. Right, of course, juif is the term means Jew in French. But then with the French Revolution and over the course of the 19th century, the preferred term of French Jews became Israelite. And it was like everything in French Jewish history in the 19th century, all the publications, everything's the Univers Israélite, the Archives Israélites, or the main newspapers. It's all Israelite. And this was because Jew kind of had a negative connotation. It was like, oppressed people who were marginalized and weren't part of French society. And the Jews wanted to reinvent themselves as real Frenchmen and Frenchwomen. And so they made up a new term for themselves, which, of course, comes from Israelite. It comes from Jewish history. But it was kind of reinventing yourself, and a new term became important. But then we kind of have a toggling back to Jew, to juif, starting in the early 19th century a little, but really after the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the idea is like, well, it didn't really do us any good to become Israelite. The Nazis, the Nazis weren't making those distinctions. And there's a certain kind of reclaiming of Jew, like, no, we're Jews. We're gonna go back to that term. But in any case, it's not. So these terms have, sort of have meaning and a sort of a political, I would say often are sort of politicized and sort of emotionally laden. Okay, so now, right. So now to look at a little how groupism, so to speak, has kind of functioned in the Jewish world to sort of understand better than this category of Sephardic. So I would just say in common parlance, Jewish people are generally described as falling into two primary groups, either Sephardic or Ashkenazi. And most notably, and often we say, and then like Ethiopian Jews are kind of a group apart, that they're apart. And there were Jews in China, Jews in India who are kind of separate from that group. So there's some, Jew groups that are kind of acknowledged they're separate. But globally speaking, it's like those are the two basic groupings that we understand. But in fact, however, these two categories have been they have shifted over time. They can be, kind of polysemous, and they're not necessarily, it's not like those groups are, completely set in time from the beginning, right? They kind of developed over time, and they're sort of, people relate to them in different ways. So this category, so generally, but just to sort of understand the basic idea, that the word Sephardic it's a word that means Spanish in Hebrew. So basically, if we're saying Sephardic, it's a population centered around, right, the Iberian Peninsula from the post-exilic era onwards. So so the first, in understanding the development of that term, the first important thing to understand is that from about the biblical era to, AD 70, the Jewish population was primarily concentrated in the present-day Middle East. So you have the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles in the 6th century leading to ancient Jewish populations in Iraq and Iran, and people spreading out, sort of throughout the sort of the Middle East. But then, so that until the early 1000s, the vast majority of Jews lived in the Middle East and North Africa, in what would become the realm of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries. But then Jewish population starts to spread out to Europe in the early Middle Ages. And you get the growth of these two main European population centers, right? So Sephardic, centered around the Iberian Peninsula, from very early on, right? They're sort of earlier. And then Ashkenazi, a population centered around Eastern France and the Rhineland area of present-day Germany from the early Middle Ages, approximately the 6th century. And so then what happens is that you get, and also while there's still Jews remain in the Middle East, sort of in terms of, you get a sort of, the center of Mediterranean Jewry moves from Baghdad to Andalusia in southern Spain in around the 10th century. You get a big population movement into southern Spain. So you get the growth of these two big geographical areas. But then what happens is you get expulsions. Jews are expelled from these European locations in the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages. So both these Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, they spread out. They go different places. So expulsions in Western Europe start in the 12th century and height in the 13th century. And most of the people there, they end up in what's present-day Poland, okay, or Eastern, Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe. So most of that population goes there, and they take with them their language, which was like a medieval German language, which became Yiddish, right? And so they sort of spread out in that area. Meanwhile, the Jews in Spain, there was a much larger Jewish population actually in Spain. There was about 300,000 Jews in Spain in 1492, and that was sort of the last of these expulsions in Western Europe was the expulsion from Spain in 1492, which was which is sort of on a much, much larger scale because you have many more people in Spain. And also Jews had been in Spain for a very, very long time. So that was a sort of a very big sort of traumatic event in Jewish history, this expulsion of this population. And so what happened was that most of those who go into exile go to neighboring Portugal, but the ambience there soon turns hostile with the influence of neighboring Spain, the arrival of the Inquisition. So basically what happens is that then the Jews of the Jews from Spain, most of them, some of them end up back in Western Europe because just as the expulsion from Spain happens, it's the beginnings of the kind of, the modern era in Europe. And you get the waning of religious fanaticism, a period of economic expansion. And some of the countries in Europe start to welcome the Jews back. So notably, like you get Sephardic Jewish populations in Amsterdam, in England, in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the majority of Jews from Spain, right? The majority of them go into the Muslim world, right? They go down into the Ottoman Empire and into Morocco. So they, taking that, and also taking their language with them, right? So they take the Spanish language, which becomes Judeo-Espanol or Ladino, right? So you have these kind of parallel processes. So then what happens is, so I wrote Ashkenazi and Sephardic emerge as reference to distinct schools of rabbinical learning and liturgical and customary practices and ethnogeographic origin categories. So here's where it can get kind of complicated because essentially the Ashkenazi and Sephardic were like ways of performing liturgy, the way there's certain, the way that's where you put the Torah in the synagogue, the kinds of songs you sing. There's certain even like rules around Passover, Sephardic Jews eat rice, Ashkenazi Jews don't. There's these sort of ritual differences. And no matter where, even so there were these very large spheres of Ashkenazi and Sephardic as sort of ways of performing Jewish ritual. Okay, but then it comes to also refer to ethnogeographical origin categories. So it's also like where you're from and where you now live. And there's this sort of overlap between them. So it means like what it means to be Sephardi can be kind of like, well, is it about following the Sephardi rite, or is it about having origins in Spain? Okay, so it's a kind of a little bit of both, depends how you talk to over time. So just to say that the categories, there's a certain fuzziness in the categories where they could mean different things. Okay, so here, specifically, the polysemous meaning of Sephardic over time and place. So here, just to note, so that when the Sephardic Jews, so they spread out over the Arab and Muslim world, so then you get a distinction in that part of the world between, there's people, as these Sephardic Jews arrive, they meet populations who had never left, right? So they're Jews in, whether it's Morocco or, in Turkey or Egypt. There's people who had just been there continuously, since, from the first exile of the Jews from Israel. They're there. Then they encounter this other population, right? These Sephardic Jews come in. And in many instances, because there was the Sephardic, it was a large group of people. So oftentimes they come in and they sometimes kind of overwhelm the native population culturally. So rather than a situation of like immigrants coming in and acculturating to the dominant culture, it's more like a big immigrant group comes in and they kind of become the dominant culture. So people might start speaking, Judeo-Espanol. And so it's sort of a mixing. But, and it depends on geography where people are. But just to notice these distinctions, like in Tunisia, you have these distinctions are between Jews who trace their origins to Spain, right? Versus people who have always been, they're in the Arab world. So the idea of the Grana versus the Twanza in Tunisia, Franco, Mustaravim in the Levant, right? So these are just to show that there was these distinctions in that part of the world between what groups people were part of. And then in Morocco, Megorashim versus Toshavim. Okay, so always on the left, it's the people who are from Spain, and on the other side are people who are sort of from that region. But overlapping communities and identities, so the idea is, right, that since it's not, oftentimes the categories aren't so set, right? That sometimes the people are very much, in these distinct communities, but then also you might have a good Spanish Jewish community that comes in and really kind of acculturates, that sort of influences the indigenous community, and they become the more dominant influence. So there's overlap between them, but there's also these distinctions. And then just making the point about Iran and Iraq, those are places where, Sephardic emigration, there might have been a few Sephardic Jews who made their way to Iran and Iraq, but it's a relatively minor phenomenon. So those communities are pretty much like you have, Jewish communities who've been there for over 2,000 years, and they follow the Sephardic ritual, but they don't really have the influence of Sephardic, Jews coming in to those two countries. So that's just a good example of where they're part of the Sephardic world religiously, but really not ethnically. Okay, whereas in other places there's more, it's more mixed. So the point is that, who is Sephardic was never a really super clear-cut thing, broadly speaking. But prior to World War I, often, the term was often used, generally associated with people who trace their family lineage to Spain. So the idea was there was these sort of distinctions. People who are Sephardic, if they trace their family lineage to Spain, and they're Mustaravim if they don't. Okay, so you have that kind of a distinction. And we see then, talking about the United States, so there's this interesting, in the early 20th century, the historian Devin Narr, who works on Sephardic Jews in the United States, and he noted that in the early 20th century, you had Jews coming over from what's modern day, from Turkey, and they're called Turkinos, so they referred to themselves as such, like they're Turkish, right? But then when they come to the United States, they adopt the label of Sephardic and because Sephardic means from Spain, it's Europe, right? And it's sort of an attempt to be more European, to be white, to affiliate yourself with sort of a white European identity, which is more, allows you more social status and privilege in the United States. So it's like becoming Sephardim had this social value in the United States. So they shift from calling themselves Turkinos to saying we are Sephardim. But that's not how they, what they call themselves in Turkey. So we see this kind of how what we call ourselves has this kind of, political, right, context. Okay, and then, then we have a big terminological intervention post-1948, which is the term Mizrahi. And what this is this term came into common parlance in Israel in the, early times in Israel. It comes from the Hebrew Edot HaMizrach, which literally just means communities of the East. And the idea was what the people who created Israel, who were almost, mostly from Europe, what they, Ashkenaz European Jews, it's what they called the Jews from the Arab and Muslim world who were coming into Israel. So the idea was, it was kind of a catch-all phrase, the communities of the East. Right? It wasn't a term that people chose. It was kind of a term that they used. And part of it was also, there was also an attempt, because originally, right, in Israel, you had Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities in Israel. But the Sephardic communities was kind of, they identified as, Sephardic coming from Spain. There was also a certain desire to distance themselves from these Jews from the Arab and Muslim world, who they saw as kind of less educated, civilized. There was all kind of negative associations. So it was like, we're Sephardim and those are Mizrahim. So the idea is some people trace their lineage from Spain, they're Sephardim, and then people who don't are Mizrahim. But in fact, the terms, as we've seen, there's really a lot of overlap. It's not really the term, it's partly just like that in Israel, people were called Mizrahim, and then in, if they're in the United States, they're called Sephardic. So it's not like it's really these set existing groups. It's all about, politics, what people call themselves, what others, call them. And so originally, there's a certain kind of pejorative connotation of the word Mizrahi as a kind of imposed category, and then that Jews kind of suffer from the Jews from the East suffer from discrimination in Israel, as they were sort of regarded as, less civilized by the Ashkenazim. Often they didn't have as good access to, jobs, education. That's sort of a whole, that's a whole topic in Israeli history. But then, what happened is, and we can think back about like reclaiming terms, reclaiming words, right? Like the Jews became Mizrif, Israeli Jew. Mizrahi kind of got reclaimed, like in the 1970s and 1980s. People started saying, I'm proud to be Mizrahi. You have a kind of a Mizrahi revival, and people looking more into their roots in Morocco, Iraq, wherever they were from. So now Mizrahi has a kind of, it has this sort of positive association where people have reclaimed the word. But at the same time, it's a word that's quite associated with Israel. That's sort of like Mizrahi. So it's not really about who the people are. It's like where they went, and then that's with the labeling. Okay, so now let's turn to the evolution of the term Sephardic in Europe and the Americas over the course of the 20th century. So you have this sort of pan-Sephardic movement starting in the early 20th century, which was initially related to the Zionist movement in the sense that, as you get these sort of organizations, sort of Jewish organizations coming in, sort of trying to group different Jews together to try to build up support for creating a Jewish homeland. A lot of them are Ashkenazi. And then so you get like Sephardic Jews saying, well, we want to contribute too. We're going to create, the World Sephardi Org Federation. And that's kind of a subsidiary part of the World Zionist organization. So they're sort of creating a group identity as part of their support for for Zionism, for building a Jewish state, but also as part of a kind of a new sense of, pride and awareness of being part of this larger Sephardic, group. And so the American Sephardi Federation is created in 1973, and I think that's, definitely related to, we think of the 60s and 70s as a time when people are affirming their particular identities, right? We talk about sort of the Black is beautiful, movement, and then other groups saying, we're going to talk about our ethnicities. We can be Americans and be, fully engaged in our origins. And so you have this sort of American Sephardi Federation, Sephardic pride, sort of distinguishing themselves from Ashkenazi, talking about their own history. And then to look at the particulars, and I'll get into this a little bit when I talk about the interviews, but there's a particularity. We see that the Communauté Séfarade Unifiée de Québec, right? The Unified Sephardic Community of Quebec was created in 1976. And that's very much connected to, that's the time when you have a French nationalist movement in Quebec, right? That the French are trying to distinguish themselves and establish their own, establish themselves against sort of the Anglophones and seize political power and have French be more dominant in the public sphere. So so within that context, the Jews who emigrated to Montreal were French speaking, and they identify with the French, with the French in Quebec. And so they create the Communauté Séfarade comes, it's very much a Francophone organization, and being Sephardic, that sort of gets its energy also from this Quebec nationalist movement, even though it's different from it. So we see also the cultural context there. And then in France, there's kind of a shift from where Jews originally in France, the majority of Jews are of Eastern European origin. And then after World War, starting in the 1950s with decolonization, creation of the State of Israel, you start getting a big influx of Jews particularly from North Africa to France. And what happens is that over the 1950s and 60s, the Jews particularly from North Africa, they go from being the minority population to the majority. Jewish. Within the Jewish world, they become the majority Jewish population. I think today it's about 70% of Jews would be or trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa rather than Europe. Of course, there's a lot of also what we call mixed marriages, people Ashkenazi and Sephardic. But the dominant culture, I would say the dominant Jewish culture today in France is Sephardic, Middle Eastern, North African. It's not the Ashkenazi. It's kind of, more minor. So, it's sort of the not more minor, but it's just that it's more the minority Jewish culture. There's been a real reversal. So within that context, so that's just a different kind of a context where you have, there's a sort of Sephardization in general of French Jewish culture in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Okay, so now to turn to, what we already know, so people have studied, there's been some, talk about, like historians and anthropologists, talking to people and getting a sense of like the use of this term Sephardic. When did people start using it? What does it mean to them? And essentially what has, been determined, so it's not like this is something that I'm new to say, is that outside of Jews who actually either spoke Judeo-Espanol or can trace their ancestry back to Spain, most of them were not familiar with the word Sephardic prior to emigration. In other words, it was like Sephardic, if people spoke Ladino, they knew somebody. But if the person was from Iran, Iraq, or even Morocco, they were just Jewish. They were from the town. I was Jewish. I was from Meknes. They didn't think of themselves. The group they were part of was Jewish, and from Meknes, Moroccan. But they didn't, or maybe not even Moroccan. They didn't think of themselves as part of this larger category, and a lot of them weren't even familiar with the term. But then the thing is that what interested me is that oftentimes it was talked about as kind of, well, people became Sephardic after they emigrated. they kind of took pride in this term, and it was a way of kind of, succeeding in their integration into France or the United States or Canada, adopting this term. And there's a lot of kind of talking about, we see how the Jews, they start to reference themselves as Sephardic post-emigration. So like in the French press in the 1950s or 60s, you'll have like the Association of, Algerian Jews or Moroccan Jews. By the 1970s, it's the Association of Sephardic Jews. So it was kind of looked at as something where Jews, these people themselves claimed this immigration, this category. They became part of this group post-immigration, and it was sort of something, a very positive thing that they looked at that they sort of took on. But in terms of that, I was interested in getting at if we look at, that's kind of public in the public sphere, if you're looking at press or archives of organizations changing their names. But I was interested in, how did people personally relate to these terms, right? Not outside of sort of public or associational history. And that's where I just thought I'd just spend a minute on oral history, with the idea of oral history being, a different kind of source. Like, how does oral history intervene to help us to understand these categories? And so here, and this is something that, how does an oral history source differ from a memoir, from literary, journalistic, or archival evidence? And and this is something especially that I was thinking about with memoirs, because of course a memoir is written by an individual person, right? And you could say, well, that's different than an archival source, which is true. But, very few people write memoirs. People who write memoirs, it's a very particular person who's going to sit down and write their memoir. And so oral history permits us to look, it's not just about getting past institutional history, it's also going out and finding people who weren't going to sit down and tell their story. And you're asking them. So it permits us to, get a different perspective. So I think that's also something that was, even though memoir and oral history, we can see similarities, it's also something that's different. And then in terms of oral history, there's the question of, so just to say that it's this idea of really getting at ordinary people who didn't intend to leave a record, right? And there's a historian, Paul Thompson, talking about oral history as having new evidence from the underside. The idea of ordinary, just trying to get at what ordinary people who weren't necessarily thinking to tell their story think about things. And then there's this question of people often say, but how do you know what people are saying is true, right? People misremember things, So their question of accuracy and misremembering. So in some instances, we can look to oral history to fill in gaps in the historical record. What do people remember, and how can that fill in gaps that we don't get from, archival or journalistic sources? But in that case, you have to be attentive to the fact. Just because somebody says something obviously doesn't mean it's true factually. And that's where sort of some of my archival work came in the sense that, I looked at the, some of the people I interviewed had been teachers in the Alliance schools, and in some instances there were dossiers on them in the Alliance archives. So it was interesting to take their interview and then look at what the archives said. And sometimes I found some interesting discrepancies or just more information or a different perspective, and just also fact-checking and secondary sources. And so in terms of people, there's sort of that aspect, that it's a source like any other, and you have to sort of check it and consider different sources. But then there's also this point about what the purpose of oral history is, and that's where this Alessandro Portelli, who's this wonderful, kind of pioneer in oral history. So I put this quote about, memory is not a passive depository of facts, but an active process of creation of meanings, right? And the idea that oral sources tell us less about events than about their meaning. They tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do, what they believed they were doing, and what they now think they did. Right. So that was something that's, very important when I'm looking at these sources, like how do people narrate their history, their personal history, the collective past, and how that's influenced by their position now, where the larger cultural political context in which they're operating, their own sort of, their own positions, political positions in different ways. So kind of looking at that intersection always. So that idea of how we remember and narrate, it's that's a subject of inquiry in and of itself, which is something that oral history, lets us get at. So now I'm just going to turn to some of the examples of how my interview. So I interviewed, one of the questions I asked everybody was, do you consider yourself Sephardic? And I was kind of said, and I've said, were you familiar with this term before you emigrated? Although I will say that in some instances, at a certain point with the people from Iran, I stopped asking the question because it was just clear that they didn't identify as Sephardic. So I asked some people, but it sort of started to seem, it became clear that it was less sort of fruitful in the sense that they were like, well, we're Iranian. Whereas for people, let's say from Morocco, from Lebanon, from Tunisia, this was sort of a really interesting way to get at the complexities of the groupism. To what degree they identify with this group or with other groups? So what I've done now is just sort of like I've taken some of the themes. So these are sort of some of the themes that came out when I asked people like if they were Sephardic. Okay, so the first theme is this idea, Sephardic means from Spain. So it was kind of people telling me, either because they had firsthand knowledge of what they called real Sephardic Jews in their family or in the broader society, they explained to me that being Sephardic means being able to trace your roots to Spain. And then they sort of how they fit in or not with that category. So here we see, this is interesting. So Gabrielle Elia, who came from Beirut to Montreal. So here we see that, right? She actually had a great-grandmother who she said spoke Spanish, okay? And then she corrected herself, Ladino, right? But then we see we always considered ourselves not Sephardic, but more Oriental Jews, okay? So she's clearly saying like her grandmother came from this Sephardic background, but then as a result, she has that reference point, but that's one great-grandmother. But then in general, the Lebanese Jews, we were Oriental Jews, right? So it's kind of Eastern Jews. So she's making that distinction. So in reflecting on the question, but it was interesting because she specified that she did know her great-grandmother. She died when she was 16. So she had this was part of her life, this Sephardic great-grandmother. But here we see she's sort of making reference to these distinctions in Lebanese society. She says, the real Sephardic Jews kept to themselves. They didn't mix and mingle. Maybe they felt superior, right? We see the groupism in Lebanon. So her grandmother had come into this group, but this was a different group than she was, globally a part of. So then I just gave the example of, So that's right. So most of my other Lebanese interviewees, they didn't specify having a Sephardic ancestor, but a lot of them were aware of the existence of this sub-ethnic group in Beirut. So it was like Sephardic Jews were one of the sub-ethnic Jewish groups in Beirut, So, but another thing, and they saw people who went to a separate synagogue and spoke Judeo-Espanol rather than Arabic. So there was awareness of that. And it was also interesting to know that that also most people also indicated that they knew about Ashkenazim because that was another sub-ethnic community in Beirut. There had been Jews from Eastern Europe who emigrated to the Ottoman Empire and especially to Beirut in the 19th century. So these are people, they spoke Arabic, they're from Beirut, but they were Ashkenazi. They had that origin, they had their own synagogue, and they kind of, like the Sephardim, the original, they sometimes, they more kept to themselves. So there was these these different categories that existed in Beirut. And some people had never heard of the term Sephardi before immigration. So there was kind of a variety in terms of that. So Nasser Rasek, I put this because this was sort of a typical of the Iranian. As I said, at a certain point, I sort of stopped asking all the Iranians about it because it didn't seem that fruitful a path of inquiry. But so Nasser Rasek, he was one of my few interviewees from Iran who emigrated to Montreal. Most of the Iranians I interviewed immigrated to either Los Angeles or to Great Neck, New York. But he said, so Nasser Rasek, he had been a teacher at the Alliance School and he was French speaking. So he emigrated to Montreal. And he integrated into the larger Sephardic community there. He was pretty clear about the fact the Ashkenazi weren't too friendly. His people were more the Sephardic Jews. There weren't that many Iranians, so that was where he gravitated. But then when I said, are you Sephardic? He said, Iranian Jews are not Sephardic. And then he sort of later, he said, well, Iranian Jews opted for the Sephardic ritual. So he made that distinction, the ethnic versus religious distinction, right? And that was kind of how most of the Iranians understood it. Yes, we follow the Sephardic ritual. We're not Sephardic. So Eli Shama, so he was from Beirut, came to Paris in 1975, kind of the last wave of emigration out of Lebanon in 1975 at the beginning of the Civil War. So here he sort of talked about, finding himself. So he's coming into France at a time when Sephardic Jews, it was mostly people from North Africa, they were kind of becoming that was kind of the dominant Jewish group already in France. So he comes in being from Beirut. He's Arabic speaking. He's coming in. He was like, he didn't really feel Sephardic, but it was like he basically said, we were assimilated to the Sephardic group, meaning like it was an imposed category. People assumed we were Sephardic, but we're not really Sephardic. Okay, so he sort of found himself to be Sephardic in Paris. He found it to be a bit of a misfit. Then this gentleman, Pierre Gomel, so he immigrated from Fez in Morocco to Paris in 1958, but he was an example of somebody where his parents were teachers at the Alliance School in Fez, but they were both originally from Turkey. Okay, so they were Judeo-Espanol speaking kind of real Sephardim, right? They emigrated to Morocco to teach in Alliance schools. So he was part of a kind of a subculture in Morocco because his parents were from Turkey. They were Judeo-Espanol. So in Morocco, he thought of it, it's like he was Sephardic as opposed to Moroccan. But then he said, when he got to Paris, he said, it was confusing. And he kind of said he just gave up trying to explain it to people. He said, most people, my friends, they don't understand that I'm not a North African Jew. In other words, it's just too complicated because it's like he's Sephardic, but he's actually really Sephardic. But, in other words, he was sort of saying, these categories, it gets too complicated. So we just see these different examples of relating to the Sephardicness in terms of Sephardic meaning from Spain. Okay, so then another kind of, theme that I ran into was kind of pushback to the question, to the idea of belonging to the Sephardic group. Say, are you Sephardic? And some people, were just kind of like, well, that's a false division and we're all Jews. And some of the people talked about, I put here the motto of the Alliance, which is Kol Yisrael Haverim. It comes from the Talmudic injunction, all Jews are responsible for one another. So it's this kind of idea of Jewish unity, right? So some of the people, they're kind of taking that. So they're saying, I identify as Jewish and I don't like these categories. Okay, so that was like another theme. So here we just see, and part of this was the fact that people were discovering a lot of divisions within the Jewish world that hadn't existed, back home. Okay, the idea of, we're talking about in the oral history workshop I did before, of the idea of like, in the Arab and Muslim world, you didn't have like Orthodox, Reform, conservative Jews. You didn't have, it's like there was more of just, was sort of a global, more of an inclusive community. People there was some pushback about divisions, and they saw the Sephardic Ashkenazi thing as, another division, and we don't like that. Okay, so there was was one of the themes that came out. So that in our home, here we're Jews, period, we didn't ask the question. So this kind of pushback against the labels. Now, here, So then we get to people who definitely did relate. I am Sephardi, people who definitely were like related to this category in a positive way. And here, so Jacqueline Tafgamash, so she was the last person I interviewed quite recently. So we see all this movement, right? Tunis to Paris, Paris to Montreal, Montreal to back to Paris, Paris to San Diego. And so she, so when I asked her about it, she said, I'm Sephardic. It's a tradition I love and I'm a part of. And she's somebody who's active in San Diego in the Jewish community. And she sort of very much identifies as Sephardic. Like she brings a Sephardic aspect. It's very few Jews in San Diego are Sephardic or relatively small. And she's sort of very much part of that community. And, it's just an identity that's important to her. Now, this is another example. This guy, Jacob Janot, so he came from Marrakesh to Israel. Then he went from Israel to Los Angeles in 1981. And this is a good example of someone, I asked him why he emigrated. And I said to my wife, let's move on. In other words, he didn't get into it too much. It wasn't something he extrapolated on, So you want us to see this idea? He just kind of got the sense of, he was ready to go someplace else, okay? And he wasn't that. And then I asked him about Sephardic, and he sort of smiled and said, Sephardic is nice, okay? Like, I'm Sephardic. But it was something where it wasn't something he thought about a lot, or he wasn't that, he didn't articulate a lot about it. But to me, the fact that he identified as Sephardic, the fact that he'd been to Israel for 20 years, to me seemed important because he'd gone through that process of kind of Mizrahi, Sephardic in Israel, and then coming to the United States, so that he brought that with him. Then if we look at Ariel Sabah Lasri, also spent time in Israel, and in her instance, she specified that she'd went to Israel from Casablanca when she was 14. She studied in a religious school, but then she indicated she went to France to go to university, and she said because it was difficult for Sephardic Jews to get scholarships. So she was kind of alluding to prejudice in Israel, that there were structural problems for the Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews. And that's why she went to Paris. Then life ended up taking her to Montreal. But she became very active in the Montreal Jewish community, in the Sephardic Montreal Jewish community. So here, as you see, she was someone who thought about, I made a conscious choice to have a traditional family with traditional Sephardic practices, right? And she chose that. And to me, that was also something reacting to the racism that she'd experienced in Israel. She was going to affirm that identity. That was also part of it. So it was different from Janot, who didn't politicize it. And we should also say she ended up marrying someone. Her second marriage was to a man who was very active in the Sephardic community in Montreal. So she was sort of very active in that community. So here, Lucienne Shani Namar, so she'd born in Damascus. Her parents were actually also Alliance teachers. They came to Beirut in 1950, and then she went to Montreal. And in the beginning, she said, she sort of said, I'm not Sephardic. And she did this sort of a thing about, she was Sephardic from her mother's side because she'd actually come from a Turkish family, kind of like, a little bit like the first person I talked about, okay, now I'm forgetting my people. Pierre Gomel, that she had a similar background to that. But then she kind of moved, the narrative moved. So she said, when in Beirut, there were Sephardic Jews and there were Arab Jews and there were Ashkenazi Jews. There were these divisions. But then she's talked about arriving to Canada, and this Ashkenazim were very disparaging of the Sephardim when we arrived. So then she kind of included herself in that Sephardic group. And she was somebody who also had worked for the Jewish community in Montreal and was sort of influenced by, there was these sort of tensions between the English-speaking Jews and the French-speaking Jews at the time. So we see how she kind of identified with the group. And then we have the Sidney Shriki, where when I asked him about it, he says, we are Sephardic, and his idea was like, I knew the story that it's time. Okay. For questions, okay. Oh, you're right. Okay, I'll finish up. So he said, we knew we were Sephardi. We knew the story. A lot of Moroccans didn't know it. So he was kind of like, I identify with that. And then I thought, Simon Khazan, this was just this sort of emotional thing where he talks about, I'm not sure about my background. He was quite knowledgeable about the different groups. But then he said this personal experience, he went to Seville in 1992 and he felt like he'd been there before. There was this sort of emotional connection to Spain. So yes, I feel I'm Sephardic. So we see how it's also kind of an emotional register. Okay, so just quickly, so there's another kind of category that's come more into the forefront in recent years of people talking about being Arab Jews. And this is something that was... so, like I said, I mean, there's people who never left the Arab world, and it's sort of just with the sort of the way the politics went. To quote my original interviewee, Arab and Jew kind of became oppositional categories. But then people have talked about, well, why can't you be Arab and Jewish if you can be Arab and Christian, right? That's an identity. And that's something that's been kind of come more to the forefront of people saying that we're Arab Jews or talking about Arab Jews. And I didn't ask everybody, do you consider yourself an Arab Jew? But some of the people specifically said that, I'm an Arab, right? I'm an Arab Jew. So that was another group to identify with. And here, just to talk about Monique Malus vaguely, she's French, and here she says, I feel like an Arab Jew. And, this idea that she says, she talked about how upset she was about Islamic fundamentalism, but not as a Westerner, as an Arab, very much this hurts me so much because I love Arab culture and I am Arab. And this is very painful for me. So it was relating, really a deep emotional connection to that. And then so we see that the categories aren't exclusive. Jacqueline Nataf Gamache, in other sense, she said, I'm an Arab Jew. So she said, I'm Sephardi, I'm an Arab Jew, right? And then she says, my brothers who live in France are less Arab Jews, sort of indicating they more identify with France. So also that there's choice in these categories. And then here, Lucien Chanine Amar, this idea, this mixing. I go to Spain, I feel at home. I take pride in being both a Jew and an Arab in Spain. So she relates to both of those histories. And then my final slide, just referencing that thing of multiple categories, people just sort of talking, often the way the narrative would move was they talk about one kind of belonging and then move into another kind of belonging, right? So here we see, okay, first she starts with idea one, Rachel Azran, it's the people who fled from Spain. I'd say Sephardic is a culture. I may feel Sephardic, even though she definitely indicated her parents were from the Atlas Mountains and were Arabic speaking. So she had no direct, Sephardic lineage. And I married an Ashkenazi, and then I feel Jewish above all. So we see how the narrative moves. And then Monique Malus just sort of talking about all the multiple feelings of belonging that she, that she has. Okay, I think, I went a little too far. But anyway, I'll conclude there. Thank you so much.
Got questions? Ask your question the mic for them for you. Questions about
Hi. Thank you. I actually had two questions. First, you mentioned how Iraq and Iran practiced Sephardi Judaism but never had any actual influence from Spain. So how did they know about that culture and those practices if they never had that influence?
Okay, because, that's a good question. What it is that there was circulation. In other words, in the medieval world, you had a circulation of Jews in around the Middle East and North Africa, and there was sort of the center was in Iraq around the 1000s was sort of present day Iraq was sort of at the center of the Sephardic cultural world. So you had, or Sephardic religious cultural world. So let's say you would have courts, let's say local Jews you have a Beit Din, a rabbinic court. Let's say someone wants to appeal a decision of the Beit Din. They would have courts that would be in another country, another area that people would go to appeal decisions that could be elsewhere in that Sephardic realm. It was kind of a large world. In the same way that in the Ashkenazi world, you had circulation. So it was so it's not that they had no connection. And then you had a move from sort of from Iraq, as I was saying, to southern Spain in the early Middle Ages, around the 10th, 11th century. But there were still Jews who were in, modern day Iraq and Babylonia. So it wasn't that they had no connection at all. It's just that when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, you didn't have a big influx. You didn't have the ethnic influx. So there was the religious association circulation, but there wasn't that ethnic influence, if that makes any sense. Okay.
And then my other question was, based on some of the people that you interviewed, some of them mentioned how they felt like they didn't identify with one group or another. They just felt Jewish.
Yeah.
Or that the groups were problematic, possibly. And my question is, do you think that the tendency to separate these people into groups comes from America or Europe or some other outside force other than within the Jewish community?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's what it is partly that people, and I think that the group categories, yes, I would say that, like, let's say in the United States, you had these categories. There was these, like you have conservative, reform, Orthodox, and then you had these groups, like there were sort of the Ashkenazi Jews were there, and then they kind of labeled the other people coming over as Sephardic. So you have these identities that are people that are different are coming in. People are labeling them, and definitely that happened in Israel with the idea of the Mizrahim, this idea of distinguishing creating this group of people. But so there were the divisions. So those divisions were created. But I would also say that there's just a sense of local, because originally people just kind of had local identities. In other words, they're Jewish, but they're just they're Jewish and they're from Marrakesh, and they're not thinking about a larger, the idea of being part of a larger Jewish group and these divisions is just kind of alien to their way of thinking. And they're oftentimes they weren't that knowledgeable about all these larger developments. So, I mean, but then it's interesting because I do also think, the other thing, though, is I think some of the people, this idea of saying we're all Jews and referring to that, there's also somewhat of a kind of a Zionist aspect to it, in the sense of saying we're all part of the Jewish people and sort of talking about Jewish unity and wanting to reference that peoplehood, that Jewish peoplehood, as a pan thing. So I think in a way there's both things going on. On the one hand, it's pushing back against divisions between Jews, but then also a sort of identifying with this larger idea of Jewish peoplehood, which is something that's important in the Zionist movement, with the idea of creating a Jewish state, and that all the Jews, they should be living together in the state, and that's unity, even though there were divisions in the state. So there's kind of multiple things, I think, going on.
All right. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you. This is very interesting. So my question is less about the content, more about your strategy dealing with so many oral histories. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that there were many points when you interviewed someone or two people on paper who had very similar identities and backgrounds, but very different or even conflicting perspectives about how they identify or how they're represented. So how, when you're writing and putting that into your full history, do you prioritize one over the other, or how do you just include both without sacrificing the other?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is that can be really interesting, because that kind of shows that you can't just say people, well, it's because they're from Morocco. Well, two people from Morocco are different. But then you kind of can look at the context, maybe one person had, joined a Zionist youth group when they were young, and they're maybe influenced by that idea. The other person, came from a little village and they didn't have much political exposure. I mean, you can sort of look at different influences, why they might relate in different ways, family background, or, there's specifics of their family. But I think that's actually an important point, because the idea of you sort of trying to tease out personal why people think the way they do and understand things. What are things in their personal background, even that are different from somebody else, even though on paper they might have the same background. So, I mean, in a way, sometimes that it was sort of a rich opportunity to look at the intersection between, the personal and the group, identity. But of course, you also do make choices in terms of everybody doesn't come into, everybody's not included like by name. Sometimes I summarize a general tendency and then I'll give 2 examples, of it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Parati. I teach political science here, and thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm actually doing some research on Moroccan Americans. As everybody probably knows, Morocco has opened up relations with Israel, and there's much more visitation by people from Israel and Jews around the world, visitation to the tombs of saints who are there. And I'm wondering whether any of the Moroccan Jews that you spoke to identify as Moroccan. Does the state have anything to do with this? Because the state itself is trying very hard to engage them and and obviously Muslim Moroccans. Was even an element.
No, it's funny. I was just looking to see if I had a quote from these 2 guys, but I think I didn't actually. Okay, yes. I would say in particular, that's a good example of something where there's a lot of range. Because some people were kind of like, I'm not Moroccan. There was a sort of a rejection of that. And they do, we were whatever, Morocco, kind of with the large overview of Israel-Palestine conflict and Arab, and they're identifying with Israel and feeling like Morocco was rejected us, and they're okay. But then other people were very attached to Morocco. I go back to Morocco every year, and so there was a lot of variety actually in terms of how the people related to being Moroccan. And there was interesting because the people who were the most Moroccan, perhaps not surprisingly, were these 2 brothers who left. They only left Morocco in 1975. Okay, to study in Paris, and then they both eventually made their way to Los Angeles, and they, so they grew up. They were born in 1962 and 64, so they're born after, an independent Morocco, right? So they're not. There's the colonial. So in other words, they're very much Moroccan. Like they just grew up as Moroccan in Morocco. They're obviously Arabic speaking. They went to an Alliance school. They were very steeped in Jewish culture, but they were completely kind of integrated also into Morocco. So, but what's interesting is their father he was a businessman, and they were saying when they go back to Morocco, that one guy was like, oh, I can barely walk 10 feet when I go to the old city because everybody knows me and they want to talk. So he has a real visceral link still to Morocco because the family stayed. And it was interesting